If you care about real survival history, not the polished textbook version, subscribe to this channel now and share it with someone who still thinks wartime shelter meant tents and barracks. What you're about to hear comes straight from the lived experience of soldiers and civilians who survived mud, snow, bombing and starvation by understanding terrain better than their enemy. During the Second World War, shelter was often the difference between endurance and collapse. Men froze, drowned, suffocated, or survived based on how well they adapted what was around them into protection. This channel exists to preserve those hard-earned lessons, and what follows is the kind of knowledge that disappears when people stop paying attention. For the first minute, let me hook you with a reality most documentaries skip. WWII armies did not rely on standardized shelters once combat began. Frontline conditions destroyed doctrine fast. What kept people alive were improvised structures built under fire, often at night, using soil, trees, rubble, snow, and wreckage. These shelters were engineered for concealment, thermal control, blast deflection, and speed. The brilliance was not in comfort, but in understanding physics, weather, and enemy behavior. These techniques still work today, whether you're studying survival history or planning for real-world emergencies. Earth was used as armor, insulation, and camouflage all at once. Across Europe and Asia, soldiers quickly learned that digging down was safer than building up. Earth absorbs blast pressure, muffles sound, and stabilizes temperature. This is why foxholes evolved into deep, reinforced fighting pits, and then into underground living spaces. German infantry units, especially those of the Wehrmacht, perfected low-profile dugouts roofed with logs, sod, and packed soil. These shelters were invisible from the air and nearly silent during artillery barrages. The practical lesson here is understanding soil depth and drainage. World War II field manuals stressed digging below the frost line in cold regions and angling floors slightly downward to prevent water pooling. If you apply this today, even with basic tools, a shallow earth shelter lined with wood or scrap material will retain heat far better than any surface structure. Earth is free insulation, and it never blows away. Snow became a structural material rather than a hazard. On the Eastern Front, winter killed more soldiers than bullets. The Red Army survived brutal cold by rethinking snow itself. Snow caves and packed snow bunkers were common among reconnaissance units and displaced civilians. When compacted correctly, snow becomes an excellent insulator, trapping body heat while blocking wind. The technique required patience and discipline, you know. Soldiers packed snow into walls, let it sinter and harden, then hollowed out the interior. Ventilation holes were carefully punched with rifle barrels or bayonets to prevent carbon dioxide buildup. Applied today, this teaches an essential survival principle. Materials that seem hostile can become protective if you understand their properties. Snow shelters still outperform many modern tents in extreme cold. Rubble shelters turned destruction into concealment. In bombed cities like Stalingrad and Warsaw, civilians and fighters learned to live inside ruins. Collapsed masonry was rearranged into lean-to shelters backed by standing walls. These spaces were warmer than open air, shielded from shrapnel, and, well, impossible to distinguish from debris piles. German and Soviet troops both exploited rubble to avoid aerial detection. Floors were layered with brick dust and fabric to dampen sound. Fires were built using smokeless methods, often fueled by scavenged furniture. For modern application, this really reinforces the idea that concealment matters as much as strength. A shelter that blends into chaos is harder to target than one that looks intentional. Forest shelters were engineered to defeat wind and observation. In wooded regions, troops avoided simple tents because they reflected light and sound. Instead, they built low, asymmetrical shelters using fallen trees and brush. These were angled against prevailing winds and roofed with overlapping vegetation. The goal was not height, but heat retention and invisibility. Japanese forces in the Pacific took this further, constructing jungle shelters with layered canopies that redirected rain away from sleeping areas while breaking up silhouettes from above. The lesson here is orientation. WWII soldiers studied wind direction, slope and canopy density before building. Today, the same awareness allows a basic forest shelter to outperform expensive gear. Underground urban shelters resisted bombing through shape, not thickness. Civilians across Britain and Germany survived air raids by adapting basements into blast-resistant spaces. The key was curved entrances and angled walls, which, deflected pressure waves. Straight corridors killed people. Rounded turns saved lives. This is a critical engineering lesson. WWII shelters didn't rely on heavy materials alone. They relied on geometry. Even today, storm shelters and bunkers follow these same principles. If you understand blast behavior, you can build safer spaces with fewer resources. Speed mattered more than permanence. One overlooked truth is that most WWII shelters were temporary by design. Soldiers expected to move. Shelters were built fast, abandoned fast, and rebuilt smarter each time. Experience refined technique. Mistakes were corrected quickly, or they proved fatal. For modern survivalists and historians, this highlights adaptability. A shelter that can be built in hours and dismantled without trace is often more valuable than a perfect structure that takes days. Learning these techniques means learning when to stop building and start resting. These shelters were not romantic. They were cold, cramped, and often terrifying. But they worked. They kept people alive long enough to fight another day or see another sunrise. If you want to keep this kind of hard practical history alive, subscribe to the channel, share this video with serious researchers and survivalists, and stay with us as we continue uncovering the real lessons WWII left behind.